All right. Hello, everyone. That was a great panel. Got to cover a couple things, and I think you'll see some parallels here as I go through my talk. I'm talking in terms of what's most important, where should, how can we focus time in different ways. I don't have all the answers today. I'm trying to propose a framework that would help us to make those prioritization decisions. So this is talking about the defensive readiness, which deals with that monitoring standpoint. And I'll start with a little vision statement. So imagine knowing that your organization has the security controls and people with the right skills for tomorrow's threats. I didn't say today's, I said tomorrow's. And a cyber actor tries to get in, but let's say stolen credentials, that's very popular now, are identified and reset quickly. So why did that happen? Because the organization targeted the right controls ahead of time and had that skill ready. But how do we do this when resources are limited? That's been a theme I've seen through a couple of the talks and the panel today of there's a lot of things we could do. What should we be doing? And that's where I kind of want to get, walk through how we can do this today. So a little background on myself. I've been in the cyber field for about almost 15 years at this point. I worked for Department of Defense years ago doing what I'll just call software testing and releasing. You can draw your own conclusions. Then I went into private sector, worked for Dow Chemical, their Fortune 100 company, and their SOC, and also kind of the pen testing. So did a lot of dual roles there in terms of designing security controls and also testing them at the same point. And through that whole point is kind of, I'd say, where I started getting the concept for what we're going to call today with defensive readiness of we look at what things are possible, but what things are actually most likely. What's the actual amount of effort that an adversary is willing to spend, or how much should a defender spend, and how can we actually wrap some quantitative metrics around that? The last thing I want for anything I'm doing is just to be Ben says. I have some solid experience, but I really want to make it more than just that. So right now, I work for a company called Rangeforce. Don't worry, not a sales pitch at all. And I'm education and product director. So I'm helping design cyber skills training to better equip readiness platforms. And a lot of the work that I'm talking about here plays into that platform. But I also want to make it more broadly available than just, come by Rangeforce. So certainly willing to talk to anyone who wants that. I've done a lot of different certifications over the years. So the offensive security ones are fantastic training. Love doing that. Gets a really good concept of that try harder mindset, which is useful for a lot of things, but not everything. And then I've done CISSP. So I've done a lot of things in lots of different domains. I started off originally as a system administrator. So it's kind of the variety of these experiences is kind of what put me in a good place to make some of these decisions about, well, how could we set up these controls? And I like to just say, general computing enthusiast. If you ever come to my house, I have a server rack in the basement, soldering table, love doing that kind of thing. A lot of fun to just go through the whole stack on that. And so I want to start this talk really with defining the possible threat actions. This should be familiar to everyone in the room. It's come up several times today, MITRE attack. And I would say raise your hand, or actually we're getting near a break, stand up for a second if this is something you use on a regular basis, for that. Yeah? You almost sitting too long, so just give it an opportunity to stand up. And so yeah, this is a great, I like to call it a great compendium of knowledge. I've been working with it for 5-6 years now. It does a good job of defining what could happen. And it's gone through some revisions, and I'd say it does that pretty well, saying, here's things that could happen. But of course, if we're talking about defensive controls, what's likely to happen? And that's that element of risk that I want to cover here. So we start looking at, we think about that whole matrix, but we can go talk about prevalence also to say, well, what actually happens? This is from a Fortinet report just 2 months ago. And you see that there's heavy influence into certain particular areas. So yes, there's that huge matrix of things that could happen, but if you're looking at the actual what's in the majority of attacks, there's relatively few things. And so this gives us a good opportunity for threat intelligence to say, well, what's actually happening? I can stop that, and we can kind of move on from that. Of course, just the fact that something was prevalent yesterday doesn't mean it will happen that way tomorrow, and that's what we're talking about before of making these threats more than just what's happening today. So that's one way you can kind of look through the attack matrix and prioritize. Another way would be to look at breadth of coverage. I did this a few years ago at Dow, my previous employer, of looking at how can we get breadth of coverage across the matrix. And this is kind of an example highlighting right now, where we say, let's aim to have at least 3 controls in each vertical or each category, or use cases, if you want to think of it that way. And so this is pretty effective. It's good for covering the breadth of the kill chain, breadth of the matrix. You can kind of focus in on choke points where adversaries have to go to one thing. The only limitation with it really is it focuses maybe too much on where it's just simple to build a control versus, well, what's the adversary going to actually do? And so when we start talking about what could an adversary do, you need to start defining what are the adversaries. There's obviously a big difference between someone who just got their hands on an exploit kit versus that nation state, like the earlier talk was saying, where they're doing custom tools, they're putting down lots of things. There's a whole spectrum there. And so if there's a way we can align these MITRE attack techniques to those levels of threat actors, that becomes very powerful for designing controls. So here's an example technique. I did not coordinate with the earlier talk when he was going over web shells, but it's a great continuity. This is an example, and again, I love MITRE attack. It defines the technique. It provides a nice technical description. It provides examples on this, this limited part. If you go to the actual website for attack, you will see for a lot of them, they have long lists of threat actors and specific IOCs, and this is really good. But where I see a limitation in this is it doesn't attempt to say what's common or what's easy versus what's really hard. There's a wide range of web shells here, and who would be using them or what would they be doing? And that's kind of key for we're looking at how to actually get to that next level of detection. So the framework I'm talking about defines 2 new terms. That's it, just 2 things. Attack capability, and then we'll talk in a few minutes about defend capability. And so an attack capability is saying, all right, I have a technique, and then I want to define what are different, like large scale buckets of it. Obviously, there's thousands of web shells, probably more than that. But I would say they all fall into one of 3 buckets. These are defined to be broad categories. So we have a public thing, an altered, and a bespoke. So if you want to think about a web shell, you could have a public web shell, you could have an altered web shell, or a bespoke one. And so what would that look like? So if we start with just the public level, these are something that exists today. You can get Kali Linux or any other kind of penetration testing kit. There's public web shells there. If you have the knowledge of how a web server works with that active web content, it's pretty straightforward to deploy them, make sure that they work and do what you want, and you can get up and running pretty easily. If you alter it, back up there. So with the public one, if you do that, take the one right from Kali Linux, drop it into your web server. If you have any basic EDR or antivirus, it's going to stop it because that's a very known capability. There's of course areas where that doesn't work, where the endpoint's not doing, the security's not doing what it should be, but in most cases it will. So then I can alter a web shell to say evade that simple detection. I've done this workshop with a couple groups of people where you take that default Kali Linux web shell and spend 30 minutes or an hour modifying it until it can evade the signature AV. It's relatively simple, but it does require more of that programming knowledge and understanding what's going on with the system. And then finally, there's bespoke, which is novel web shell. You're not starting from anything existing, just kind of some existing techniques, or maybe you're baselining an environment as a threat actor and saying, I need a specific web shell that looks like this. That's going to require even more knowledge. And so this attack capability concept defines time, or if you want to consider effort, for each of these. And so to keep things simple and keep us out of the weeds of debating 1 versus 2 hours, I've aligned everything to orders of magnitude. So if you wanted to learn how to use a public web shell, it's something we could probably teach you to use it within an hour or so, assuming you're reasonably competent with computers. And everyone here is well beyond that. We could alter it, which is going to require some of that programming knowledge. It's probably going to take closer to 10 hours total, including learning about the programming. And then finally we get to that bespoke, it's something that's going to be more like 100 hours. At this point, we're not only talking about programming the web shell itself, but also any environmental things that need to be considered there. And so if we start talking about that, now we can have a concept of effort, who would be doing each of these? And this is where we kind of break down 5 levels of threats, from opportunistic to that strategic level. And what I like to tell people colloquially is level 1 would be your script kiddie, your friend Davey who got his hands on some basic things, to level 5, which of course is that strategic. Think APT. They're going after something very valuable to them. And within each of these levels, there's a 10x improvement or increase as you go from left to right of how much effort they're willing to put in. So someone on the left, that purely opportunistic, think you're just your general web scanners, think broad-based email. Sometimes even business email compromise can fit in here, though that tends to be a little higher. Up through that level 5 where they can put thousands of hours into something. So with that now, we have, we have different levels of attack capabilities. And I don't have a good visual for it, but I've gone through attack techniques and mapped those capabilities for all of them. There's this other side project, I would say side project, but newer project, MITRE Defend. It's still in beta right now, but maturing nicely. And it's been very useful for saying, what can the defender do? And one of the things I really like about what MITRE's done with this is that there's a data model that links the attack techniques to defend techniques. And that's something that we can leverage in building this defense capability module to say, all right, if I'm concerned about a altered web shell, what defensive controls do I need to have in place to find that? And so this framework has been really good about defining those. Still being worked on, and I'm very excited to see how this continues to evolve. And so, but similar to the attack techniques, we need defend attack capability needs to be defend capability. And so similar here, there's different levels of sophistication for each of those defend techniques. At the highest level is just referred to as a vendor capability. This is something managed by a security vendor. You need to have some of them in your environment. This is perfectly fine. They cover a lot of use cases, which is why they're useful. And the security professional just needs to know about them. If you're a small shop, this is something that probably you can purchase a capability. It will defend against a lot of what you need to. And all you need to worry about is just that it's working and at if it escalates, what kind of things. We can then move up to a tailored capability where this is something that the security professional needs to understand using. So a good example here would be some kind of log aggregation, whether it's a SIM or something else, where now I'm taking some vendor thing or open source project and I'm tailoring it into my environment. So I'm now going and saying, which systems do I have? What am I most concerned about? Like, know your business. That's another good concept here. And how do I build the controls around that? And then finally, optimized. This would be going to your automation, your playbooks, beyond just I'm getting the data and I know what to do with it. This is saying I'm now applying that defensive capability and able to go to the next level. For anyone who's familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, the highlighted terms play to that, because one of my goals out of this is to say not only just what vendor solutions or open source you should have, but also what skills, what abilities do you need to have. And this kind of plays into say, all right, if we're concerned about this set of attack techniques and this level of attack capability, what level of defense do I need against that? And this is kind of getting into a threat model kind of thing. So this is where we start pulling things together. Right? I've defined red capability, blue or attack capability, kind of a red team thing, and defensive capability, a blue team thing. How do they relate to each other? And this is where, again, I just wanted to stay focused on kind of the high level. We can certainly come up with examples of how individually these are wrong, but in aggregate, I've run some tests and we'll run some case studies here in a minute of it seems to generally work, where if I say there's a, so the middle, the second column there, the public threat, if I'm facing a public capability, again, that lowest level of attack technique, a vendor defense can stop that or detect it at least 90% of the time. It's kind of that risk-based thing. If I have tailored defenses, again, I know my environment, I've done baselining, I've set up specific assets or watch lists for assets that I'm concerned about. We increase that to 99%. And if I have a fully optimized defensive capability, I can block that effectively all the time. Though, of course, nothing's 100% in security, so we have to say 99.9%. So this looks really good for the defenders, which is important. If I flip over now to that altered, now we're getting to uncommon, where again, this is the adversary doing some kind of small change, but still fundamentally the same technique. They're able to do it, say, or they can bypass the vendor detection 90% of the time. And this is something that red teams have to spend a lot of time in this space, this vertical, if you will, because they want to make sure they're getting past the lowest level controls to get to that next level. If we have a tailored defense, now you see that we get back up to 90% detection. So if someone's coming after me with altered techniques, again, that are altered capabilities, that variation on the attack technique, I'm going to need to make sure I have tailored defenses, at least against that control. And then again, optimized is still very good. If you see a pattern here, you probably can guess what the last column is going to say, where we talk about bespoke threats. So if the bespoke threat, if an attacker builds a bespoke threat, I expect it to evade a vendor control 99% of the time. This is where if someone's in this case where you only have vendor controls and someone's coming after you with bespoke tools, I hate to be the one to break it to you, you're probably going to fail. And so that's where we need to say, all right, if someone is coming after me with that level of effort, I need to get not only tailored, I need to get to optimized defenses. And so this chart now, as you see in aggregate, we have 90% kind of down the middle. And then on the lower left, the blue section, this is where the defender generally wins. And on the upper right section, the red, this is where the attacker would generally win. And so we kind of have two axes here based on effort level. And we might all say, well, we just need to get everyone down to optimized controls. But the reality is not everyone's facing those bespoke threats, or at least not from the all the time. And that's something where threat intelligence can help a lot with that in terms of defining what's coming out and helping me optimize the defenses ahead of that. Conversely, whenever you get something into the upper right corner where that very advanced tool is going against a organization that say has their default IDS, their default SIM configuration, yeah, the attacker's probably going to win, and hopefully that company doesn't just get totally wiped out with ransomware. But this is kind of a way to show that balance. So again, if we kind of recap here to think about, we have a set of attack capabilities that are those common, uncommon, rare, or public, altered, bespoke. We can pull it together to say, here's a set of defensive capabilities that would give me at least 90% confidence that I'm going to stop the threats. And so this is kind of where we pull together some of the different concepts we've been talking about. So we'll talk through here. So if we're at DRI 1, this is that Defensive Readiness Index 1. The targets, the people that are, or the adversaries coming after me would be things like opportunistic threat actors, or that script kiddie level. What are they going to be using? They're going to be using publicly available malware, credentials, other TTPs, simple things, and generally define it as less than 1 hour of effort per target. And I want to highlight the per target part because that deals with prevalence. If the same attack or the same technique is sent against many attackers, it becomes more common and therefore easier to detect. And so as we stay at this low level, we're expecting you're only going to get hit with things that are very common. And so what kind of controls here at a high level would be things like automated machine detection, signature-based, again, that vendor concept. As we move up into DRI 2, there's that concept of a prudent threat actor. This is where you have, say, 1 hour of effort per target again. So if I spend 10 hours developing some kind of capability, some kind of tool or web shell, and then deploy that against 10 targets. I'm at DRI2. And so this is now where we start getting into the tailored controls of, it's not just, do I have the out of the box device sitting there, but is it set up for my environment? Do I need to be looking at other open source projects, other techniques, things that will help me to get to this level? As you get up into DRI3, now emerging actors, this is where e-crime and hacktivists would kind of play a lot of times. This is where they're going to get more into altering. They have more skill. They have the ability to make more of those changes. They probably are doing like hands-on keyboard type things, if you're familiar with like Metasploit, Cobalt Strike. And this is where that next level of control, in particular threat intelligence, becomes a requirement. And we want to look beyond just exact IOCs. We want to look more at TTPs. And then finally, I'll just, DRI 4 and 5, those established and strategic. This is where someone's going to be putting a lot of effort into some kind of against some kind of organization. They are the adversary, where we really need behavioral detection, and you need analysis of the environment, kind of baselining, that kind of thing. This is where we talk about 100 hours or 1,000 hours. And one of the key things here is it needs to be worth it. So we're talking about threat actor doing something. They want to get some ROI. This is something where I was reading about ransomware the other day, and the average payouts, I think for last year was around 200, or the average ask was around $200,000 US for each breach, and something like 30% of actors or victims paid it. That would imply something like a $60,000 expected value. We have to lower that a bit more because of they did that against a number of targets. But you start seeing how they could get ROI of, if I'm putting 100 hours into this operation, I want to make sure I get money back or some other kind of collection or intellectual property. As you get up into DRI 5 especially, it's no longer usually just about money. You're trying to get something beyond that. And that's why the strategic actors are really going after that. So the defensive capabilities for each of those kind of increase like a maturity model. If anyone's here is familiar with like the CMMC from the Department of Defense, this was actually originally, some of DRI was originally inspired from that. And it is sort of a capability model to say, if I am expecting, or if I have something that would be of a 1 hour ROI for an attacker, I should be at DRI 2. And here's the definition of what skills and capabilities I need to have at that level. And of course, it increases. From this chart, it's kind of roughly linear. But again, this is going after or compensating for attackers that are, say, going at 10x every level. So from DRI 1 to 2, someone's spending now 10 times the amount of effort at each one. And so this is actually some good news for defenders. And this comes out of the model where, again, we look at what's the set of attack techniques, what capabilities are in scope for, hey, if I'm spending up to 10 hours on an attacker, which set of controls or which set of attack techniques can I use for that, all the way through to which defense capabilities map to that. So I want to do a quick case study here. This is one from I got a Cyber News article a few months ago. So kind of get back to that concept of web shells, kind of a case study of what does that look like in an actual attack. And so this was there was a large breach for a number of companies with this stealthy new backdoor. So it can kind of key in on those the terms there of, all right, so something stealthy implies it was kind of customized for this. And so here's the lines from the article. Research identified a stealthy new malware that threat actors have been using for about 15 months to backdoor Exchange servers. Okay, so this was malicious software. It posed as a legitimate module for IIS, the main Windows web server, and that's installed by default on Exchange servers. And so from this one, we can say that we know how they got in. It was proxy logon or variation of that. And then someone put a bunch of effort or spent a lot of time to build a custom backdoor for that. And so that's where they start to say they sat there for a long time. Why did it sit there for a long time? Well, the attackers had good OPSEC. So what was the initial access here? They exploited a public-facing application. In the case of the DRI model, we would say it was an altered form of that. It took some effort to take the open, this was around the time proxy logon first came out as was released as a POC, but someone at this organization needed to have skill to alter that for their goal. And then persistence, this was the focus of the article. There's a server software component, that's the web shell in attack parlance. They made a bespoke version of that and were able to put it down. I say bespoke because they made it blend in. They looked at what was used in these environments and made sure that it was very stealthy at that. And so here's kind of the mathematic model to say, all right, if they spent 100 hours on that exploiting public-facing application, and they also spent about 100 hours, let's say, building on a server software component, that bespoke version, and then just another 100 hours on other tools, because from the attacker lifecycle, there's a lot more than just those two things. And they use that against 24 targets. That's what they talk about in the article. So that would say roughly 23 hours, and add in another few hours of what we'd say, computer network operations. So if someone actually was working on those targets, you end up with about 23 hours per target. And again, remember back to the maturity model, this is saying this would be somewhere DRI 3.5, 10 hours would be like exact DRI 3. In this case, it's a little more, but it's a logarithmic scale, so that's where you kind of end up at 3.5. So the question here is, were those organizations operating at what I would define as DRI 3? Probably not, because they got breached. But then the other question is, do the defend capabilities that we get from the model make sense for defending against that kind of threat? Which is, I would say they do. So flip over to that. And this is talking about putting those capabilities and skills in more of a, terms that more like SOC managers, SOC analysts would understand, of not just talking about file content rules or application hardening like Defend does, but what does it actually mean in terms of what I would need to deploy on my network? So this is an attempt to summarize kind of what would be the output of that model. I have a lot of huge spreadsheets that did not make pretty slides, so this is the better way of trying to show that. And so you see, if I'm, again, I expect an adversary to do something like that against me. They're going to spend 20, 30 hours. I would want to have these kind of skills in place. Or if you said, Ben, you're now the SOC manager for this, what do you want? These would be things I would want to have, is to say, all right, I need some kind of endpoint AV. I need some kind of perimeter, although the perimeter's going away a lot now. I need EDR rules. I need to have OS alerts. I need to have some of those basic things. And then I'm going to need my team to focus more on or have the capability to do malware sandboxing or central searching of logs, or more of that OS auditing of what's actually happening on the endpoint. And then I'm going to really want to make sure I have a couple of optimized capabilities, because again, at this point, the adversary is, at least for web shells, willing to go to a bespoke version of it. So I can't count on my endpoint security to just have a signature for it. I'm going to need to have some more specific, like user activity thresholding or net flow monitoring, or just general telemetry, to understand when something bad is happening, even when I didn't have just a straight up threat intelligence for it. And it doesn't specifically call threat intelligence here, but since that's been a heavy theme today, I'll throw in that the vendor capability is implied to be a threat intelligence feed of some sort that you as an organization or as an individual don't manage. When I purchase a license for endpoint, some kind of endpoint security, it's coming with a threat intelligence feed where, if we're talking about back to those very common threats, those should mostly all get stopped more or less immediately. Unless I happen to be the first person that got hit by them, which is unlikely. More often than not, we'll see what we cover on the next slide. So WannaCry. So this is talking about that life cycle of, you might have already been thinking, well, Ben, if some things are bespoke, but then what happens if they get sent out to the world? Here's a perfect example of that. And the answer is the DRI model changes, but we can talk through that. So if we start about, so this is in particular Eternal Blue, the SMB exploit that was kind of the main reason for WannaCry. At some point in the last, who knows, before 2017, some organization made a bespoke, reliable zero-day exploit against that common service. So this is something for anyone who maybe is not familiar with it. In an enterprise Windows environment, server message block is enabled by default. Pre-2017, everyone had SMB-v1 enabled, and the Eternal Blue exploit existed at some point prior to 2017 when it got kind of public. So, and you can read it, look at some of the write-ups of it. It was an incredible, like, actual engineered piece of software, not just an exploit, but it actually had like elegant coding in it. And so that was clearly something that was 1,000+ hours. And again, I stress that it existed before 2017 because it was probably being used in very targeted applications because some organization had put that much time into it. They don't want to lose that capability. And this is something that I've seen with the time as penetration tester is if I get something that works really well, I want to keep it to myself because the more it gets out in the wild, then the lower the lower the threshold to detecting it. And so that's where there's you could almost call it a risk assessment for an attacker. It's kind of an interesting thing. And so at some point there in early 2017, it got weaponized as worming malware. And originally for spreading ransomware, and there were several high-profile examples, of course, where this got out into the wild. Different orgs hadn't patched yet, or just had generally poor hygiene, and this shut down many organizations with some bad impact, unfortunately. The good news is, for the defenders at that point, the patch was available, and a lot of endpoint security, of course, was looking for it and able to lock it down. So that's where there was a transition point where it became very, very, let's say, prevalent in the environment. And then we could say there's like an altered version of it. You saw some variations on WannaCry that maybe took, let's say, 10 hours to make those changes and now target other organizations that would kind of put it back up into that DRI-3, where again, you're no longer subject to that individual IOC or other kind of block. Another case study, let's kind of run through here. So this is from just a couple weeks ago. A threat actor came up with a new method of running PS-exec APIs directly from Windows without having to go through some of the like the sysinternals tools. I would just estimate that probably took about 100 hours of knowing OS internals, of being able to put together some of the programming knowledges, testing everything to build that. And this was effective because it bypassed existing controls for, again, the first targets of it. So the first people that were used against kind of needed to be at that DRI-4 level. But then as it became more broadly known, again, I got this from a Cyber News article, I would expect endpoint to security to be able to look for non-standard ways of calling those APIs, which lowers the threshold for detecting this particular technique. So I'll kind of get to the next steps here. What's my ultimate goal out of this? It's to say what attack techniques and more importantly, which defend capabilities are the most important. So again, that's back to that concept of prioritization. And so there's the whole concept of measuring where you're at today and then developing those skills and controls to close the gap. In terms of measurement of today, it's I'm working on putting together something we can release more broadly. I'd say for right now, anyone who's interested in learning more or talk, please chat with me after or hit me up on Slack. Because it's like I said, it's kind of a maturity model. Want to be able to say where are we at today in terms of what I can defend against, but then also develop those with that maturity to improve everything as you go. And so that's where some kind of training plan roadmap or new prioritize what new capabilities I should deploy or configure in my environment. So when I say picking your target defensive readiness, this is the goal is to say find what defenses are that high return on investment. Think about how much effort would an adversary use to target you. If an adversary thinks they can, get $100,000 ransom from your organization, you want to make sure that you're, thinking about what capabilities would play into that. And one of the other key things here is to say not everyone needs to be at DRI 5. But if I go back to think back to the huge MITRE attack matrix, one of the things I didn't mention then, because it's too much, is to say, well, what if I focus on everything? I just want 100% coverage of MITRE attack. To which I would say, if you're in a large organization, think government or other very large private company, you probably do need to be looking at that. That's going to be very high cost. There's a lot of effort associated with that as a defender. And so what I'm trying to do is define those slightly smaller sets of things to say, all right, if I'm only concerned about that DRI 3 threat, what do I need to get to that point? That's going to be, again, higher return on investment for the defenses to make sure that the threats that matter are able to get out there. And so that's kind of where we're at for today. So happy to take any questions now if there are, or again, feel free to chat with me afterwards. So like I did mention, I'm looking for a better way to actually share out something that's not just a bunch of spreadsheets and charts. So that's something, if you'd like to learn more about, or you have an idea for how you could share that, I'll be happy to talk to you on that. But otherwise, again, thanks for listening today, and great to be at Sans Blue Team.